March 17th, 1944, Southeastern England, 0740 hours. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the tarmac when Hauptmann Klaus Richter first heard it, a sound he would later describe in his interrogation notes as Die Symphonie des Untergangs, the Symphony of the End. It was not the piercing wail of air raid sirens or the thunder of anti-aircraft batteries that had become the soundtrack of his war. It was something far more unsettling, the methodical, mechanical hum of American industry at full throat. 200 B-17 flying fortresses sat on the hard stands of RAF Dienethorpe, their Wright Cyclone engines being tuned, their gun turrets being calibrated, their bomb bays being loaded with the cargo that would soon rain down on the fatherland. Richter stood in the back of an open truck, his flight suit still reeking of aviation fuel and cordite, his hands bound with hemp rope that chafed against the raw burns he had sustained when his Messerschmitt Bf 109 had cartwheeled across a Kent barley field 3 days prior. He was 26 years old. He had 73 confirmed kills painted beneath his cockpit canopy. And in this moment, staring at the endless rows of aluminum bombers gleaming in the weak English sun, he understood for the first time that Germany had already lost the war. But it was not the bombers that broke something fundamental in his understanding of the conflict. It was what he saw beneath one of them, a woman. She could not have been more than 22 or 23. She wore blue coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and engine grease. Her hair was tucked beneath a bandana, printed with small white stars on a red field. She lay on a mechanic's creeper, half disappeared beneath the nose of a B-17 called Memphis Belle II, her hands working with practiced efficiency on the landing gear assembly. Beside her, another woman, older, perhaps 30, stood on a work platform, torque wrench in hand, tightening the bolts on the number 3 engine cowling, with the kind of casual competence that spoke of thousands of hours of experience. They were not nurses, they were not secretaries or communications specialists, or any of the auxiliary roles Richter had been taught women occupied in wartime. They were mechanics, engineers, technicians. They were doing the work that kept these fortress bombers in the air, the work that enabled them to carry 2 tons of high explosive across the channel and into the heart of Germany day after day after day. Richter stared. The other captured Luftwaffe officers in the truck stared with him. One of them, Oberleutnant Werner Schilling, muttered something in dialect that Richter did not quite catch, but the tone was unmistakable. Disbelief shading into something close to horror, because what they were witnessing was not merely women performing mechanical work. What they were witnessing was the complete inversion of everything they had been taught about civilization, about natural order, about the proper arrangement of society in wartime. In the world they had come from, the Reich of prescribed gender roles and Kinderküche Kirche, women did not touch machinery of war. Women certainly did not crawl inside the belly of strategic bombers and rebuild their hydraulic systems. To see them doing so was to understand that America possessed something Germany did not, could not, and would perhaps never comprehend. A reservoir of human capability so vast and so carelessly abundant that it could afford to mobilize everyone regardless of ancient prejudice or tradition. The truck lurched forward. The moment passed. But the image remained, burned into Richter's memory with the same indelible permanence as the faces of men he had killed. They did not speak of it immediately, the captured pilots. They were processed through the POW intake at the interrogation center in Cockfosters, north of London. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and cataloged. They were stripped of their personal effects and issued gray wool uniforms stamped with the letters PW in red paint. They were questioned by intelligence officers who spoke perfect Hochdeutsch and knew the names of their squadron commanders, the specifications of their aircraft, and the locations of their airfields with unsettling precision. But in the evening, locked in a holding barracks with 17 other newly captured Luftwaffe personnel, the conversation turned inevitably to what they had seen. "They have women building their bombers," Schilling said, his voice flat, with something that might have been either wonder or despair. "Women, working on combat aircraft." "Not just working," said another pilot, a boy of barely 19 named Dieter Hoffmann, who had been shot down on his 4th operational sortie. "Did you see how they moved? They knew what they were doing. They were not pretending. They were not merely assisting male mechanics. They were the mechanics." "Impossible," said an older man, a Staffelkapitän named Georg Meinhardt, who had flown Stukas over Poland and France before transitioning to fighters. "You misunderstood what you saw. They were perhaps performing simple tasks under male supervision, cleaning components, organizing tools." "I know what I saw," Richter said quietly. "The woman beneath the bomber was reinstalling a hydraulic actuator for the nose landing gear. That is not a simple task. That requires understanding of pressure systems, fluid dynamics, mechanical tolerances. She was doing it alone. No man stood over her shoulder." Silence settled over the barracks like a physical weight, because every man in that room had been raised in a Reich that had systematically expelled women from higher education, from technical professions, from any role that was not directly related to childbearing and homemaking. The Nazi state had been explicit. A woman's battlefield was the home. Her weapons were children. Her victory was measured in the number of sons she could give to the Führer. The entire ideological architecture of National Socialism rested on the presumption that men and women occupied fundamentally different spheres, that this separation was natural and immutable and ordained by blood and soil and destiny. To suggest otherwise was not merely politically incorrect, it was unthinkable. And yet they had seen it. They had seen American women doing technical work that German women were legally prohibited from doing. They had seen a casual demonstration of gender equality that would have been considered degeneracy or Bolshevism or Jewish corruption in any propaganda ministry briefing. And worse, far worse, they had seen that it worked. The American war machine was not weakened by the inclusion of women in its technical workforce. It was strengthened. The bombers flew, the missions continued, the Reich burned. "How many?" Hoffmann asked softly. "How many women do you think they have working on those aircraft?" None of them knew. They would not learn the true numbers until much later, after the war, when historians would tally the accounting and discover that by 1944, nearly 350,000 American women worked in the aircraft industry alone, that firms like Boeing and Douglas and Consolidated employed women not as token gestures or public relations stunts, but as essential, irreplaceable components of their manufacturing capacity. That Rosie the Riveter, a propaganda creation intended to encourage female war work, had been based not on fantasy but on mundane statistical reality. That America had mobilized its female population for industrial war production on a scale that dwarfed anything attempted by Britain or the Soviet Union, and that exceeded by orders of magnitude anything Germany had even considered. But in that barracks in March of 1944, they knew only what they had seen, and what they had seen was enough. To understand the depth of the cognitive shock these men experienced, one must first understand what they had expected to find when they crossed the Channel to fight the British and Americans. The Luftwaffe's pre-war intelligence on the American military had been to put it charitably, inadequate. Much of it was based on observations from the 1930s, when the United States Army Air Corps had been a backwater force, flying obsolete biplanes and operating on Depression-era budgets. German military analysts had noted correctly that America lacked a strategic bombing tradition, that its pilot training programs were small and poorly funded, that its aircraft industry was fragmented and inefficient. They had concluded incorrectly that America would be unable to project meaningful air power into the European theater, and that even if it could, its forces would lack the technical sophistication and warrior spirit necessary to compete with the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe. This analysis had been reinforced by Nazi racial ideology, which held as axiomatic that Anglo-Americans were a mongrelized people, corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro admixture, weakened by democracy and materialism, incapable of the kind of disciplined martial excellence that characterized the Aryan fighting man. American soldiers, they were told, were soft. They had grown up in a land of plenty, with no experience of hardship or sacrifice. They would break when confronted with true warriors, with men who had been forged in the crucible of National Socialist discipline and tested in the fires of the Eastern Front. The existence of women in the American war machine had not even been considered. Why would it be? In the German understanding, women were biologically unsuited for technical work, for mechanical thought, for anything beyond the nurturing and reproductive functions that were their natural role. The few women who worked in German war industries did so in unskilled positions, sewing parachutes, assembling small components, packing supplies. The idea that women could be trained as aircraft mechanics or electrical engineers or hydraulic specialists was simply not part of the conceptual universe in which these Luftwaffe pilots had been raised. And so when Richter and his fellow prisoners saw those women beneath the bombers, they were not merely surprised. They were confronted with empirical evidence that the foundational assumptions of their entire worldview were wrong. If American women could master complex technical skills, then perhaps women were not naturally inferior in technical domains. If American industry could achieve massive production increases by mobilizing its female workforce, then perhaps the Nazi model of rigid gender segregation was not optimal. If America could fight a global war while simultaneously expanding rights and opportunities for half its population, then perhaps democracy was not the weakness the propaganda ministry claimed it to be. These were not comfortable thoughts for men who had spent years dropping bombs on cities and strafing refugee columns in the name of a totalitarian state. But April 1944, POW Camp 23, Lancashire. The interrogations continued, though they were gentler than the prisoners had expected. The Americans and British were interested in technical intelligence, radar systems, aircraft performance characteristics, airfield locations, but they were also, Richter noticed, interested in psychology. They wanted to know what the German pilots thought of America, what they had been told before deployment. What surprised them most about the Allied air forces? The interrogators were patient, almost conversational. They offered cigarettes and hot coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute that had become standard in Germany. They treated their prisoners not as subhuman enemies, but as professional adversaries who had simply been on the wrong side of a military engagement. During one such session, Richter found himself across a small table from a British intelligence officer who introduced himself only as Captain Morrison. Morrison was perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen combat in the previous war. He opened a folder, glanced at Richter's service record and smiled faintly. You've had quite a career, Hauptmann. 73 confirmed victories. You were an ace before the war turned against you. Richter said nothing. What surprised you most? Morrison continued, lighting a cigarette and pushing the pack across the table. About the Allied forces? Not tactically, we've covered that. I mean, philosophically. What did you see that challenged your expectations? For a long moment, Richter considered remaining silent. But there was something about Morrison's tone, not hostile, not mocking, genuinely curious, that made him decide to answer honestly. The women, he said, the women working on your bombers. Morrison nodded, unsurprised. Ah, yes, that does tend to shock you fellows. In Germany, Richter said slowly, we were taught that technical work was beyond feminine capability, that women lacked the spatial reasoning, the mechanical intuition, that to put them in such roles would be to waste resources and compromise efficiency. And yet I saw them doing the work, competently. Without supervision? Richter paused, searching for the right words. It made me question what else we had been told that was false. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying the German pilot with something that might have been sympathy. The thing you have to understand about America, Hauptmann, is that it's a nation built on pragmatism rather than ideology. When the war started, we, Britain and America both, faced a simple problem. We didn't have enough men to both fight on the front lines and maintain production at home. Germany solved this problem with slave labor. You imported millions of foreign workers, treated them as disposable resources, worked them to death. We solved it differently. We asked who in our society has skills that are not being used, and the answer was women, millions of women. So we trained them, we gave them the jobs, and it turned out they were just as capable as men, sometimes more so. But the social consequences. What social consequences? Morrison interrupted gently. Our societies did not collapse. Our families did not disintegrate. The women who wanted to return to domestic life after the war will be free to do so. The women who want to continue in technical professions will have that option as well. We expanded freedom, we expanded capability. The only consequence is that we discovered we had been wasting half our human capital for centuries. Richter had no response to that because Morrison was right. The evidence was incontrovertible. America had mobilized its female population for war work, and the result had not been social chaos, but the largest industrial expansion in human history. In 1944, American factories were producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one ship every day, quantities of tanks and trucks and artillery pieces that exceeded the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. And they were doing it in significant part with women. In his cell that night, Richter lay on his bunk and thought about a photograph he had seen in his briefing materials before his first mission to England. It had been included in a propaganda ministry assessment of American morale, intended to demonstrate the degeneracy of Allied society. The photograph showed an American factory, he could not remember which one, with rows of women working on an assembly line, building what looked like engine components. The caption had mocked this as evidence of America's desperation, its need to resort to female labor, because its men were too cowardly to fight. But now, looking back on that image with eyes that had seen the reality of American air power, Richter understood that the propaganda ministry had gotten it exactly backward. The photograph was not evidence of weakness. It was evidence of strength. It showed a nation that was willing to use all of its human resources to break with tradition and prejudice in pursuit of victory to value competence over conformity. Germany could not do that. Germany would not do that. Even as the Eastern Front collapsed and the Reich itself teetered on the edge of annihilation, Nazi ideology forbade the kind of total mobilization that might have made a difference. German women were not trained as aircraft mechanics or tank drivers or combat engineers. They were exhorted to bear children, to support their men, to sacrifice in the traditional feminine ways, and so Germany fought its war with one hand tied behind its back, crippled not by lack of courage or fighting spirit, but by an ideology that insisted half the population was inherently unsuited for technical work. The Allies had no such handicap, and that perhaps more than radar or the P-51 Mustang or the atomic bomb was why Germany was losing. The symbol that haunted Richter's dreams in the months that followed was not a weapon or a flag or a piece of technology. It was a simple object, a torque wrench held in a woman's hand, tightening bolts on a bomber engine with practiced efficiency. In his nightmares, and he had many in the POW camp, that torque wrench became a kind of talisman, a physical manifestation of everything the Reich had failed to understand about modern war. Because the torque wrench represented precision, training, competence, applied without regard for gender or ideology. It represented the idea that the task mattered more than the identity of the person performing it. It represented a society that could set aside its prejudices when survival demanded it. Germany had built beautiful fighters, the Me-262 jet, the FW-190, aircraft that were in many ways superior to anything the Allies fielded. But Germany could not build enough of them because Germany had decided that half its population was unsuitable for factory work. Germany had trained excellent pilots, men like Richter himself, with hundreds of hours in combat and the kind of tactical skill that came only from experience. But Germany could not replace them when they were shot down because Germany was running out of fuel and instructors and time. Germany had fought with courage and discipline and tactical brilliance, and Germany was losing because all the courage in the world could not compensate for the simple arithmetic of mobilization. When one side is willing to use 100% of its human capital and the other side insists on using only 50%, the outcome is not in doubt. By the summer of 1944, as the Allies broke out from Normandy and began the long drive toward the Rhine, the captured Luftwaffe pilots in British POW camps began to receive letters from home. The letters were censored, of course, entire paragraphs blacked out by intelligence officers, but enough remained to paint a picture of a collapsing society. Food shortages, bombing raids that turned cities into funeral pyres, the inexorable advance of Soviet armies from the east, and running through all of it, a note of bitter incomprehension. How did it come to this? How did the 1,000-year Reich, which was supposed to dominate Europe for generations, find itself staring at annihilation after barely 12 years? Richter knew the answer. He had seen it on a tarmac in England, embodied in a woman with a torque wrench. December 1945, Repatriation Processing Center, Frankfurt. The war had been over for 7 months when Richter finally returned to Germany. He traveled by train from the Channel Coast through Belgium and into the Rhineland, staring out the window at a landscape that had been systematically dismantled by Allied air power. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges collapsed into rivers, factories gutted by fire. The infrastructure of an industrial nation built over a century, erased in the span of 5 years. And everywhere he looked, Richter saw women, German women, clearing the rubble by hand, forming bucket brigades to pass broken bricks from the ruins, rebuilding what the war had destroyed. They were called Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, and they constituted the primary labor force in the immediate post-war period because there were not enough men left. The men were dead or captured or missing somewhere in the vastness of Russia. The Reich had insisted that women's place was in the home. And now the home was rubble, and women were building it back with their bare hands. At the processing center, Richter was issued discharge papers and a small packet of occupation currency. He was given an address for his family, or what remained of it. His father had died in an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg in 1943. His mother had survived, but was living in a displaced persons camp outside Cologne. His younger brother, who had been drafted into the Volkssturm in the final months of the war, was listed as missing, presumed dead. The nation Richter had fought for, the regime he had served with such dedication, had consumed his family and millions of others in pursuit of an ideology that had promised glory and delivered only ash. Before he left the processing center, a British officer approached him, not Morrison, but someone similar, someone who had spent the war conducting interrogations and making psychological assessments. The officer handed Richter a pamphlet. It was in German, printed on cheap paper, and the title read, "Democracy and the Future of Germany." "Read it," the officer said, "or don't. But you might find it useful as you figure out what kind of country you want to rebuild." Richter folded the pamphlet and put it in his coat pocket. He did not read it then. He read it later, on the train to Cologne, sitting in a third-class compartment crowded with refugees and former soldiers, all of them silent with exhaustion and trauma. The pamphlet was propaganda, of course, produced by the Allied Control Council, designed to sell democracy to a defeated population. But it was also, Richter realized as he read, simply true. It explained that democracies were not weak but strong, because they harnessed the talents of all their citizens rather than a narrow elite. It explained that free societies could outproduce and out-innovate authoritarian regimes because they did not waste human potential on the altar of ideology. It explained, in careful and accessible language, why Germany had lost the war. There was a photograph in the pamphlet. It showed an American factory during wartime, women and men working side by side on an aircraft assembly line. Richter stared at that photograph for a long time. He thought about the woman he had seen beneath the bomber, the woman with the torque wrench, the woman who had represented everything the Reich had taught him to despise. And he thought about how that woman and millions like her had helped to build the air armada that had destroyed his country. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. Ideology that contradicts reality will always lose to pragmatism that accepts reality. Germany had built an entire state on beautiful lies about blood and soil and the natural order of things. America had built its war effort on the unglamorous truth that people are people and competence has no gender. It was not a comfortable lesson, but it was, Richter understood now, a necessary one. In the decades that followed, when historians and psychologists would interview former Luftwaffe personnel about their experiences as prisoners of war, a surprising number would mention the same moment of cognitive dissonance, seeing women working on American military aircraft. For men who had been raised in a totalitarian state that explicitly defined gender roles as biological destiny, the sight of female mechanics represented something more profound than mere cultural difference. It represented evidence that their entire worldview was constructed on false premises. And once that first premise fell, that women were naturally unsuited for technical work, others followed in rapid succession. If women could be mechanics, Perhaps racial categories were not as rigid as the Nazis claimed. If democracies could mobilize total populations for war, perhaps authoritarian efficiency was a myth. If America could simultaneously expand freedom and wage total war, perhaps there was no necessary trade-off between liberty and power. These were ideas that would take years to fully internalize. Many of the captured pilots never did internalize them. They returned to post-war Germany still convinced that National Socialism had been correct in principle, merely defeated by weight of numbers and material. But for others, like Richter, the woman with the torque wrench became a kind of catalyst, the first crack in an ideological edifice that would eventually crumble entirely. Richter would live until 1989, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunified under a democratic government. In his final years, he gave occasional interviews to historians researching the Luftwaffe and the POW experience. In one of these interviews, conducted in 1987, the historian asked him when he first understood that Germany had lost the war, not operationally, not in terms of specific battles, but metaphysically in terms of the fundamental contest of systems. Richter's answer was immediate. March 1944, on a tarmac in England when I saw an American woman repairing a bomber landing gear. The historian, puzzled, asked him to elaborate. Because in that moment, Richter said, I understood that we were fighting an enemy who was not constrained by our prejudices, who could mobilize resources we had declared off limits to ourselves, who could innovate in ways we had decided were impossible. We were fighting with half our population sidelined by ideology. They were fighting with everyone. The outcome was never in doubt. We just didn't realize it yet. Epilogue: The Torque Wrench and the Truth. In the great accounting of World War II, the battles won and lost, the cities destroyed and rebuilt, the technologies developed and deployed, small moments often contain larger truths. A torque wrench in a woman's hand, tightening bolts on a bomber engine on a misty English morning in 1944, seems too modest a symbol to bear the weight of historical significance. But symbols do not choose their power, they reveal it. The women who worked in American aircraft factories during the Second World War were not revolutionaries in any conscious sense. Most of them understood their work as temporary, a patriotic duty performed in extraordinary circumstances. When the war ended, many returned to traditional domestic roles without complaint or resistance, but their work had nevertheless demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated. That women could perform complex technical tasks with the same competence as men, that gender was not destiny when it came to mechanical aptitude, that societies which mobilized all their human capital would always defeat societies that arbitrarily excluded half of it. For the captured Luftwaffe pilots who witnessed this reality, the cognitive impact was profound and lasting. They had been raised in a system that promised them superiority, racial, cultural, ideological superiority. And they had discovered that this promised superiority was a fiction, maintained only by refusing to acknowledge evidence that contradicted it. The woman with the torque wrench was that evidence, impossible to ignore, once seen, impossible to rationalize away once understood. In the end, Germany did not lose World War II because its soldiers lacked courage or its engineers lacked skill. It lost because it had built its entire civilization on premises that were fundamentally false, and false premises cannot sustain a nation under the stress of total war. It lost because it had decided that half its population was unsuited for technical work, and in doing so had crippled its own capacity for production. It lost because it had confused ideology with reality and reality has no mercy for such confusion. America won, not inevitably, not without sacrifice, not without its own contradictions and hypocrisies, but won nonetheless because it was willing to be pragmatic when pragmatism was needed, because it could set aside prejudice when survival demanded it, because it understood, however imperfectly, that strength comes from utilizing all available resources, not from adhering to ancient hierarchies of gender and race. The torque wrench then becomes something more than a tool. It becomes a kind of philosophical instrument, measuring the distance between what we believe about human capability and what is actually true. It measures the gap between ideology and reality. And in that gap, entire nations rise or fall. Klaus Richter understood this in the end. He understood that he had fought for a beautiful lie, and that he had been defeated by an unglamorous truth. The woman beneath the bomber, whose name he never learned and whose face he barely saw, had taught him more about the nature of power and civilization than all the propaganda lectures and racial theories of the Third Reich combined. She had taught him that freedom is not weakness, that equality is not degeneracy, that a society which trusts its people, all its people, to rise to the challenges of war and peace alike is stronger than any dictatorship, no matter how disciplined or ruthless, and that in the end, the torque wrench matters more than the swastika. Because the torque wrench builds, and what is built endures, long after the banners have faded, and the anthems have fallen silent, and the armies have gone home.